Like, am I doing all these Orthodox rituals and observances in order to get from God? And is God going to be nice to me? And is he going to repay me? And what if it feels like I'm not getting back as much as I'm putting in? Is it worth it? Hi, I'm Rabbi Yoni Katz.
Hi, I'm Yoni's wife, Rivky.
It's our pleasure to respond to the many questions and comments that came in online about Jewish marriage, dating, and general home life. How did I meet my wife? Well, it was a Monday night. It was 11:14 and I got a phone call on my cell phone. And it was a friend of mine who was a rabbi in Pittsburgh, where I'm originally from. And at the time I was 29 years old. So that was considered ancient in Hasidic circles. I was just waiting for the right one. And this rabbi from Pittsburgh who I grew up with said, "How would you like to go out with Rivky?" I did a little research, and 2 days later we met, and 2.5 weeks later we were engaged. I believe it was 11 dates in total. Are we really happy together? Well, in order to answer that, we would have to define happiness. There's a common notion, I think, that marriage is all about give and take. And in Hasidic philosophy, we're taught that marriage is not about give and take. That's more of like a business transaction, but rather giving and receiving. The husband gives himself completely, and the wife receives the husband completely. So in marriage, there's no taking. The husband literally is responsible 100% for the wife, her happiness, and even the wife receives the husband 100% as he is. And that will lead to happiness.
So what's the role of the woman, of the wife, in an Orthodox Jewish relationship? The wife is the center of the home. The wife is the home because the whole marriage is built on her desire for marriage. Because she feels the yearning for her husband, therefore her husband senses it and responds and says, "You want me? Then you have me." It begins in her. The whole dance of marriage starts in the woman and is dependent on the woman. So as long as she's in touch with her desire for her husband and then for her children, then there's a beautiful, safe, secure home. As soon as there's no woman yearning, God forbid, for her husband or for her children, everybody feels like clutter in the home. Because what makes everybody else necessary is the woman yearns for them and wants them there. And then they feel like they're in heaven because they're exactly where they belong. But what makes them feel like they belong is her yearning.
And I think the wife, the mother, has to be constantly put on a pedestal in the house. So it's the father's job to always make sure, are the kids respecting, listening to mommy? Like, that's the ultimate. And that's sort of the husband's role, to reinforce the queen of the home is getting the respect, the help, the support that she needs, because there's nothing more challenging than running a healthy, successful home. Why is Judaism based on matrilineal lineage? Well, first of all, it's deduced from a verse in the Bible which indicates that it's based on the mother. But also, the mother is the one who carries the child, the baby in the womb. So that sort of overwhelms who this child's going to be. So if the mother's Jewish, then the baby is Jewish. As far as which tribe you belong to, that goes according to the father. Or if you're a Kohen, if you're a priest, that goes according to the father. But the very fact that the mother carried you in the womb for so many months and sort of allowed you and ushered you into the world, that decides if the child is going to be Jewish or not.
Imagine, it wouldn't be right to the mother.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be right to the mother. She carried the baby for 9 months, and now the baby doesn't have the same identity as she has. Who she is has a very big effect on the baby after 9 months of carrying. The father has the effect. His Jewish spark went into the baby, but does it last? It's the mother that has the lasting effect.
Is it still customary for a Jewish man to have more than one wife? The answer in today's day and age is no. One husband, one wife. And the simple explanation for that is marriage is all about giving yourself completely 100% as the husband, and the wife receiving you 100%. So in today's day and age, more than ever, this idea is necessary, and you could only give yourself 100% to one wife. And the wife can only receive the husband 100% if he's totally committed and dedicated to her.
Probably in the beginning of history, they needed to populate the world. So that was a big focus of marriage. But as we're going on in history, marriages have become more and more intimate, more and more personal between husband and wife, more and more what marriage is supposed to be. The personal, deep connection between two people becoming one.
How would I respond to my child dating or marrying a non-Jew? I'd be very disappointed, but it's not about so much why I'm disappointed. I know that God would be disappointed because he said, if you're Jewish, I need you to marry somebody else who's Jewish. So it's not really about how I personally would feel. Each person could feel differently. But what we take into consideration is God's need. And God says, if you're Jewish, I need you to marry somebody Jewish. So I'd be disappointed because ultimately God is not getting what he needs. And he's very clear about that in the Torah. If you're Jewish, you need to marry someone Jewish.
Also, marriage is a reunion, not just a union. So if marriage was a union, you take any two people and they can come together and have a happy relationship. But marriage is the reunion of two parts of a soul that were one, were separated, and come back together. Just like Adam and Eve were first one in one human body, and then God separated and said, but now come back together. So a Jewish soul was one with another Jewish soul and then separated. So the reunion can only happen between two Jewish souls coming back together or two non-Jewish souls coming back together. And God will bring you to the part of your soul you were separated from, and it will be a reunion and not just a union, which makes marriage very, very powerful and something that you work on that can help it last forever when you realize this is not just somebody I found, but we were once one and we're back together.
Do we think it's a slippery slope as far as educating our children to be Orthodox, but yet having them engage in secular society? The answer is no. In order to make this world the way that God needs it to be, you need to engage with society, secular society, because if we would just close ourselves off in an Orthodox ghetto somewhere, then how would that accomplish the global purpose of creation, which is not for us to get to heaven, but rather to bring heaven down to earth? So in order to bring heaven down to earth, we have to engage with everyone and anyone and have the conversation about why was this world created in the first place, or what's the purpose of creation? So it would be contrary to God's purpose if we didn't engage with secular society. So the point is to engage with secular society, but to engage in a meaningful, sort of heavenly way, in a purposeful way, not just to have a good time.
And the best thing for our children is to teach them and show them, what the purpose of creation is, why we do the Jewish things we do, and that it's not just about how we personally choose to live our lives. When you're engaging with society, then you're forced to explain the deeper understanding to your children, which is actually the best thing for your children. When you're closed in a society where everyone's doing the same thing, you're not necessarily forced to give your children the whole big picture of what they're a part of.
Why would God take a soul that's in heaven and send he or she down to earth? What could be better than being in heaven? So God says, I'm sending you down to earth to engage on earth and to engage with other human beings in order to bring heaven down to earth. Not just to live here on earth for 80, 90 years and go back to where you started from. So the whole purpose of creation, the whole purpose of bringing a child, another human being into the world, is to engage with society and uplift it and elevate it to the way God needs it to be. What is the most challenging part about being Orthodox, and how do we support each other in that challenge and in that struggle? Well, I think in general, the problem with being Orthodox or very religious, it can become very self-centered, very self-focused. Like, am I doing all these Orthodox rituals and observances in order to get from God? And is God going to be nice to me? And is he going to repay me? And what if it feels like I'm not getting back as much as I'm putting in? Is it worth it? So that's the real danger zone of any religion, because what's the problem with most religions? It's you serve God and you're intended to get some prize, and it's usually in the afterlife. But then are you really serving God, or are you serving yourself? It's like putting away some money in your 401k plan. So in essence, the reason that we do all these rituals and observances and Orthodox behavior is not to get from God, but to give God what he needs from us. What I get from God, ultimately it's not important. As long as God is getting what he needs, that's all I care about. And it's the same thing in marriage. Am I a good husband? I don't know. You know what it takes to be a good husband? As long as my wife is getting what she needs. Am I a good father? You know what it takes to be a good father? As long as my children are getting what they need. Am I an Orthodox Jew? You know what it takes to be an Orthodox Jew? Like 613 things? It's impossible. As long as God is getting what he needs. So I'm trying to do the best of what God needs, not the title, and not focusing, is this good for me? Am I getting my fair share? I'll never be happy. So when you wake up in the morning, the goal is not to be Orthodox. The goal is not to be religious, but rather give God what he needs. Give my wife what she needs. Give my children what they need. Give every other human being what they need. And that's how you'll have a united together world.
That's called a relationship. When we look around our kitchen and we see a kosher kitchen, and we have the milk side and the meat side and double dishes and double pots and pans, what do we need that for? It's like, how did this happen to our kitchen? How do we have milk and meat and double? God's opinion is alive and well in our kitchen. So every time we notice our kitchen and we not notice the double dishes and the extra effort we have to put in to keep kosher, we're noticing that God is with us in this home. The relationship is alive and well, and that gives us joy. So if you stay focused on the who you're doing it for, there's always joy. But the moment you lose focus and it becomes about what you have to do as a Jew, then it does get hard. So how do we support each other? Is we support each other in reminding each other what this is all about.
Why do Hasidic women cover their hair with a wig and spend thousands of dollars on it? Doesn't that seem immodest? If you look throughout the Bible, constantly it says, and Sarah was beautiful, and I think Rebecca was beautiful. So the Bible, the Torah itself, sort of promotes this idea of women being beautiful, but yet obviously very modest, because that's the bedrock which will produce a loving, caring, united relationship. So the question is, are beauty and modesty a contradiction? And we know in Hasidic circles, especially, women cover their hair with wigs that are often very expensive. And the idea is women are encouraged to be beautiful, and beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So it's almost a public sort of thing. Modesty is also very encouraged, and modesty is not a contradiction to beauty. So you could be beautiful, but modest. How is that possible?
So what is modesty? So beauty is great. There's nothing wrong with beauty. But what's modesty? Modesty doesn't mean timid, afraid to be you, afraid to show yourself. Modesty is saying, I have an inner world and an outer world. Modesty protects your inner world. And modesty is a reminder for yourself to look inside for your identity, not only outside. So your outer self should always be beautiful, but don't only get your identity from what you look like on the outside. It's, who am I? I'm not my outside. my biggest identity, main part of my identity, comes from who I am on the inside. And modesty puts a border between my outside and my inside. And the one that benefits the most from my modesty is me.
What is the Orthodox view on birth control? When you go right to the beginning of the Bible, God says, be fruitful and multiply and conquer the earth. And it's an interesting way of putting it. Conquer the earth, be fruitful and multiply and populate the earth. What's the idea of conquering the earth? Conquering the earth means conquering that earthy mentality, that physical mentality of how am I going to do that? You know, people have 2 kids and a dog and you're good to go. How many kids do you need? And the answer is, again, we're not focusing on how many kids you need. God says, be fruitful and multiply, meaning God needs as many souls as you can usher into the world, Jewish and non-Jewish. This applies universally. God says, you can't imagine how happy that makes me. There's nothing holier than bringing a soul into the world. So obviously, in certain cases, and that's has to be discussed with a rabbinic authority of contraception or birth control. In certain cases, it's necessary for, multiple reasons as far as health and certain things that can come into play. But in general, the idea is be fruitful and multiply and bring as many souls into bodies as you can, because we got a big job to do. We got to bring heaven down to earth. And for that, it's all hands on deck. So right from the get-go, God says, conquer that mentality about how am I going to do it? How can I afford it? I think recently the Wall Street Journal came out with an article that it costs to raise a child from 1 to 18, $300,000. So you imagine a couple when they get married and say, let's have 7, 8, 9 kids. You're talking about millions of dollars. You could be intimidated. But somehow, if you visit enough Orthodox Hasidic families, they make it happen. So right from the get-go, we don't ask those questions. We go in with the attitude that we are able to do it, and God will help us and God will bless us. And each child that's born brings in more blessing.
The greatest blessing in the world is to have children. And again, it's an inner yearning, an inner desire that wants the child, not something that's imposed on you. It's a response to your own personal desire. And the prayer that we have for God is, please help me have my children. Give me the strength. Give me everything I need so that I can have my yearning fulfilled for all the souls that are meant to come through me. Each one is a blessing. But we do have to be careful because God is very protective over his children. So if in the back of your mind, husband or wife during conception are thinking, I hope I don't get pregnant, then you have to be on birth control, because God does not want his children coming into the world feeling unwelcomed. So birth control is absolutely necessary when the yearning for the child is not there. Then the birth control is necessary. But as soon as the yearning is reawakened in the mother and the father, then birth control is not necessary. This is the best way to bring in a child to the world, through yearning for them.
How can some Orthodox men refuse to give their wife a get, a Jewish bill of divorce? It's beyond me, because actually in certain circumstances, it is actually a commandment or a mitzvah to get divorced when necessary. So obviously, if the wife is asking for it and it's gotten to that point, in most cases, obviously I can't speak for across the board, it's absolutely necessary to give the get. And by no means does it mean that these two people shouldn't have been married, that this is one big mistake that should never have happened, especially if there are children that are born from that marriage. How could you say a child's a mistake? How could you say a marriage is a mistake? Meaning the magnitude of marriage is so large, so important, so meaningful to God himself. It's not possible that it should never have happened. But in certain circumstances, there needs to be a get, a bill of divorce given in order for both parties to separate and move on. So the question is asked, if every Jewish marriage is a reunion of a soul that was once one, that was split into two and now reunited, what happens in the case of divorce? Was it not one soul that reunited? And the simple answer is, based on Kabbalah Jewish mysticism, is sometimes a soul is split into thirds or quarters. So it was a reunion, but at certain times, it moves on to a different part of the soul. So it's, God forbid, not a mistake. The marriage was supposed to happen for the exact amount of days, hours, minutes, and seconds that it did happen. And in that circumstance, the Jewish husband should give a divorce. How do we educate our children to continue living this Orthodox lifestyle? I think the number one thing that a child needs to understand when they're brought up in a Torah observant home is the constant emphasis on who we're doing this for. Nobody likes to be told what to do. Nobody likes rules and regulations. So if you sort of teach the Torah and the Bible as, here are all these rules, and if you don't follow them, this is what's going to happen to you. Nobody really responds to that. The number one thing that you need to show any child is how much they're needed. People respond to being needed, not being needy. So when we raise our kids, we're not trying to promise them all the goodies that's awaiting for them either now or in the future, but rather show them God needs you to do this. You're on a special mission. God needs you to make the world the way he needs it to be. We find that overwhelmingly the children respond to that. Like the other day, one of our children was about to eat something, and we said, oh, don't forget to make the blessing. And the kid's like, oh, I don't need to make the blessing. And we said, we know you don't need it, but God is waiting to hear your blessing. Meaning, we always have to make the personal relationship with God the center and the focus of everything. What advice would we give to a younger couple that's just embarking on this holy institution called marriage? Any ideas?
Definitely to cherish your spouse. Realize that this is the greatest gift you've been given in life, is to not be alone, to have each other. There's just nothing compares to having the gift of each other, the gift of marriage. And don't waste time with the petty things. And it's inevitable that as soon as you get married, there's going to be things you're going to see about each other that you weren't expecting, that you thought, would be different. But that's all things. Yeah, things can always be better. And there will always be someone else that can come along later that can be better looking or smarter, or things can be better about somebody else. But we're not looking for things. It's not the reason we got married. You got married to not be alone, to have each other, and you have each other. And the more you focus on the beauty of having each other, the more the things don't bother you. Things that normally would bother you don't bother you. It's not about work and compromise and, just deal with it. No, it shouldn't be hard. If you're excited that you're with each other, then even the things that normally might annoy you in someone else, in your spouse, it doesn't bother you, because you feel so lucky to be together.